right, everyone. So welcome to our class. We're going to look at the scientific method today. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the scientific method, or you may have used the scientific method before. There are many different applications for this type of thinking and analysis. And of course, you're going to be using that throughout the course of the semester and all of the science courses you end up taking here at Our Lady Queen of the World. What is the scientific method? So it's a process of how we can find answers to questions about the world around us. So it's essentially a way of thinking that is strategically meant to answer a question, or it has a purpose to it. So is there only one type of scientific method? Absolutely not. So there are many different versions of the scientific method that exist. Some have lots of steps, some have very few steps. But essentially, it depends on, well, how complex is the question we're trying to answer and how in depth we want to go to pursue it. Even though there are many different types of scientific methods, there are a few things that are common no matter what. So you always have to start with a problem or a question that you are trying to answer. Of course, you're going to be conducting some sort of experiments and using observations to analyze and try to get an answer to that question. So no matter how many steps you have, that's kind of the baseline for what the purpose is. So hypothesis. So a hypothesis is an educated guess based on the observations and the knowledge that you have of a topic. So the method of writing a hypothesis is always an if, then, because statement. So if something were to happen, then this is the result because of the knowledge that I know on that topic. So I'll give you an example. Let's see, let's do a good one here. Okay, so let's say we're going to look at this example later on anyway, so we'll talk about it. So let's say we wanted to look at how sunlight is going to affect a plant's growth. We can say, if a plant is put out in the sunlight, then the plant will grow because the plant is able to perform photosynthesis, right? So obviously you do need to have some sort of background knowledge on the topic. So you had to know that plants do photosynthesis to answer that. It starts to become very hard to create a hypothesis unless you have some sort of background knowledge. So usually before you even create a hypothesis, it's typically done on something you either know information about or you'll have to research information before you create a hypothesis. So then there's some sort of data collection. So we do an experiment and we have to gather information from it. So whenever we use the term data, that's what we're gathering from the experiment itself. So that can be data that is based on numbers, or that can be data that's based on visual observations. So for example, the plant grew 5 centimeters in 1 week, right? So that is a numerical data. We can write down an observation that the plant has now 2 flowers on it, right? So numerical data. You can also look at observations like the chemical reaction in the beaker turned blue, right? So that's not using numbers, but you're still using your skills to observe and collect information. So what are the steps of the scientific method that we're going to be using and that we use most often here in high school anyways? So first we identify the problem or the question we're trying to answer. We then create a hypothesis. We then create an experiment, or you are given an experiment to do. You do the experiment. Of course, then you collect and analyze your data, and then you communicate your results by having usually a conclusion. So the first step is very straightforward. You want to have a problem or a question you're trying to explain the answer to. So you can address a problem that is either given to you. So I might give you a problem we're trying to answer. You may want to research something you want to know the answer of. But regardless, you start always with something to lead you to what you're trying to accomplish here. So hypothesis, as we mentioned, is always an if, then, because statement. So you're saying what you think will happen. So you never want to start your statement with I. And that's a very common mistake. So a lot of students want to say, I think that this will happen. So no, you never want to use personal pronouns. You always use generic. If this happens, then this will be the result. Because of what? So you never use the I statement. Okay, so then of course you create an experiment. How are you going to test your hypothesis? How are you going to be able to ensure that you're creating a good experiment? Now, I'll be honest, in grade 9 and 10, you will be given your lab experiment. As you become more confident and you get more used to doing labs, once you get into grade 11 and 12, you will then begin to have more of an input on the types of experiments you're going to do, especially if you continue in AP prep. Okay, so then you're going to go and do the experiment. So once you've decided on what you're doing, you would then follow the steps and record any data and observations from that experiment. Then, of course, you're going to look at your data. So how did this relate to your hypothesis? Is the data you collected reliable? Maybe there was a mistake that was made and you need to start over again. When you're looking at your data, sometimes it doesn't match. What happens if it doesn't, if it's not reliable, or if it doesn't match what you think should have happened? Well, then you're going to have to modify your experiment. Very rarely does something you do or plan out happen for the first time you do it. So, even for the labs that I'm going to give you to do, or any other teacher will give you to do, that took a lot of time to try and create a good experiment. Good experiments that work properly don't get done on the first time you try them. So it takes time to have improvements. So you may have to modify and redo your experiment. Then, of course, once you have your results that are sort of more in line and reliable, you then write a conclusion that summarizes what you found. Did it match your hypothesis? What do you expect would happen if you were to continue and try something else new? You always want to try to continue thinking about ways you can improve. So even though your results were really good and you felt the experiment went well, there's always ways to try and make something even better. So here's the example that I was mentioning to you before. So let's say we were trying to, our problem is we've planted some flowers and we notice they're not growing anymore, even though we're watering them every day. So the question that we're trying to answer here is, why are the planted flowers not growing despite daily watering? Okay, well, we're going to make an if then because statement. So since the flower pot is in the shady area of the backyard, you develop a hypothesis. If the flowers were placed in the sunlight, then they will begin to grow. So notice it's an if then statement. Now, you remember I mentioned an if then because. So if then is always used. The reason why I mentioned the because is since you know a little bit about the topic, you should be able to hypothesize why you've made your choice as to what you think will happen. So since I know about flowers and I know how they work and how they grow, I would mention if the flowers were placed in the sunlight, then they will begin to grow because they can perform photosynthesis. So the reason why you don't always have to have a because is sometimes you're going to be making a hypothesis on something that you may not know a whole lot of information about. So obviously the best type is one you do know information. So we always want to try to research and have that information for us so we can make that judgment call. But um, if let's say you're stuck and you don't know the reason why exactly, you could always just keep it as an if then statement. Okay, but the best type of hypothesis statements is adding on that because portion at the end. So then we're going to do the experiment. So you decide to test your hypothesis by placing one pot of flowers in the shade and one in the sun, making sure that everything else stays the same. So that's important because you can have a whole bunch of things impacting the flowers. We want to make sure that it's only the sunlight. So you want to make sure, let's say it's the same type of flower, same type of soil, same type of pot that it's in. Make sure it has the same amount of water every day. You want to try to keep everything else the same. That way we can know if the sun is having an impact or not. So then you're going to analyze the data. So the flowers that were in the sunlight grew more efficiently than the one placed in the shade. So our communication could be, well, the flowers grow better in the sunlight. Plants and flowers should be placed in the sunlight along with being watered daily. So we've written our conclusion. Okay. Okay, so we're going to do another example together as a class, looking at this scientific method here. But what we're going to do is we're going to do one that's from our worksheet. That's going to be part of our homework. We'll look at what the different sections are and the order that they should appear in.